Woman who reunites with her lost son discovers shocking truth about maternity home. Margaret Early was 16 years old when she found out she was pregnant. Although she was planning to marry her high school boyfriend George Katz, her parents decided to send her to a maternity home on Staten Island. It was 1961 when she gave birth to her son Stephen, but she would not believe what was going to happen years later. This is the story of a mother that was separated from her child and discovered an awful truth about the maternity home where she gave birth. After Margaret was sent to the maternity home, she gave birth to a baby boy. However, it was not as peaceful as she expected. Margaret had to give birth to her son on her own and was not even allowed to hold the baby. In those years, adoption was some kind of business for agencies, and many young and unmarried women had to suffer the consequences. Margaret was not an exception. The agency responsible for the maternity home obligated her to sign the adoption papers. Threatened to be sent to a juvenile prison, she signed the papers and was told that the baby would be adopted that very week by a wealthy diplomat, someone who would give her child a prosperous life. Little she knew what she was going to realize decades to come. The time passed and Margaret happily married George and ended up having 3 more children. They also moved to New Jersey to live in the suburbs. Even though she began a new and happy life, Margaret never stopped wondering about the child that was seized from her. Every time her husband presented a possibly hereditary disease, she called as if in some way she was taking care of her son. However, all her intentions were worthless since the institution continued dismissing and humiliating her in every call. In the end, all her worries remained in prayers for her son. It was only in 2014, 53 years later, that a man from Portland, Oregon named David Rosenberg called Margaret to tell her that he believed to be her birth child. As a 2-year-old boy, David was adopted by 2 Holocaust survivors named Ephraim and Esther Rosenberg. The agency clearly deceived Margaret for years by telling her the baby was being adopted the same week of his birth. It took David 8 months in foster care before he was adopted, and after 11 days he was surprisingly returned by the first parents due to upsetting behavior and unhandled nightmares. Luckily, 2 years later, Ephraim and Esther appeared and were loving and caring parents who gave David a happy life. Still, David was curious to know about his mother and where he came from. Now as an adult, married and with 3 children, he was ready to find out. In 2013, he decided to take a DNA test, which helped him to get to Margaret and his siblings a few months later. The loving reunion happened in July 2014. Margaret and her daughter Sherry stayed with David a couple of weeks in Portland. Although they were happier than ever for meeting again, it turned into a bittersweet situation because David was dying from thyroid cancer. In spite of this, they all spent joyous days sharing love and delicious chocolate cakes Margaret prepared. Journalist Gabrielle Glazer took this moving story for her new book, American Baby: A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption, to tell the story of millions of young women who went through the same struggles. After World War II, up to 3 million women were forced to give up their children for adoption. Being pregnant unmarried was rejected by society in those times since parents had higher expectations of their daughters and sons. According to Glazer, an unplanned pregnancy was an obstacle to a better life that needed to go away. During these decades, unwed pregnancies ascended to more than 400,000 cases. As a result, maternity homes popularized in the US, hiding young pregnant women and enhancing adoptions. But this was way more than a social issue. Adoption agencies had darker intentions on maternity homes. Privileged girls were able to spend their pregnancy days in luxury. Maternity homes like the Willows in Kansas City helped women to experience an upper-class pregnancy, where they could enjoy piano practices and comfortable massages. Unfortunately, not all had the same luck. Those girls whose parents could not afford wealthy houses were forced to work peeling potatoes, scrubbing floors, doing laundry, or so on. In addition, rooms could be overcrowded with at least 20 or more girls. Some had to sleep in sofas or examination beds. Young women like Margaret had to deal with plenty of difficulties. Staten Island, where Margaret stayed, was by far one of the worst houses. From going through the trauma of giving birth alone to being separated from their children right away, girls in this home were not psychologically prepared to face the upcoming situations. But this was not the worst at all. Adoption agencies had more perverse purposes. On one hand, a high number of adoptive parents used to pay large amounts of money in order to stay in the waiting list, which allowed agencies to keep taking money from them and fill their pockets. Glazer in her book points out that Louise Wise, the agency that owns State Island Maternity Home, reached a budget of more than 600% between 1950 and 1966. On the other hand, newborn babies were used for medical and scientific purposes. From harebrained experiments to twin and triplets experiments, the babies were subjected to risky circumstances. It took years for this to change, and although it was a sealed deal among most of the states that helped to keep this horrifying secret, the laws changed throughout the years, as well as society's idealizations of sex and adoption. The legalization of abortion in 1973 had a huge impact on unwanted pregnancies, reducing it considerably and allowing single mothers to free themselves from the guilt. There have been a lot of unfortunate stories like Margaret's, but it is pleasant to know that there is always a way to find the truth. David and Margaret had a last call after they reunited, a first and final "I love you" that marked the beginning and the end of a mother's struggle.